Talk about an Old English Christmas, and for the majority of people, images of snowy landscapes, chirruping robins, rosy-cheeked children, mounds of festive food, and a beautifully decorated Christmas tree will all spring effortlessly to mind. Folk slip easily into reminiscing about Christmases past, when snow was whiter, holly greener, turkey tastier, and presents much better than they could possibly be today, in fact, beyond compare. Tinged heavily with nostalgia, the major influence on such a view of Christmas belongs distinctly to the Victorian era, when the celebrations of the season took on a whole new character. The Queen, whose name graces this most significant period of history, ruled between 1837 and 1901, and she probably contributed a great deal more to our present-day Christmas celebrations than any other monarch. Looking at this stern picture of Queen Victoria as a grand old lady, it's hard to imagine her as a lively young woman who was just a mere slip of a girl who began her reign at the tender age of 18. Yet it was ironically her choice of husband that gave us our best-loved Christmas tradition, most definitely stamped with Victoria's royal seal of approval. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha married Queen Victoria in 1840. And although his aristocratic credentials were impeccable, it was without question a love match. By the end of the year, their first child had been born, and the young royal family fascinated and intrigued the nation. More offspring were soon added to their number. In total, there were to be 9 children, and fashion followed wherever Queen Victoria and Prince Albert led. The youthful husband and father was devoted to his family, and like so many other parents before and since, he wanted to share with them his cultural heritage. This proved to be most significant at Christmas time, as the prince's German origins meant that he had always celebrated the festival rather differently to his English wife. But, just like the success of their marriage, the two sets of Christmas customs worked very well together within the royal household. When Prince Albert made a gift of a beautifully decorated Christmas tree to Queen Victoria, complete with tiny flickering lighted candles, he was continuing a tradition that had been much loved in Germany for as long as anyone could remember. More than 1,000 years previously, tree worship had been pretty much the norm, particularly with the ancient pagan German communities who lived amongst the country's magnificent forests. At first, mighty oaks were the honoured species, but as early missionaries attempted to introduce Christianity, the pine tree came to prominence. Being an elongated three-pointed triangle, it was said to represent the Father, Son and Holy Ghost, which kept the Christians happy, and, as the old pagans were not being asked to give up their tree-worshipping beliefs altogether, everyone was content to live and let live. The decorating of trees in winter certainly dates back to these ancient times, although it originally took place outdoors. As the leaves fell in winter, simple country folk believed that the spirits who usually lived in the trees and blessed their families with plentiful food supplies had run away. To entice the spirits to return, people would drape brightly coloured scraps of cloth and strings of brightly painted pebbles all over the bare branches. Naturally, when spring came and the leaves burst forth once more, an awful lot of congratulating went on, as the tree dressing had evidently had the desired effect. With the advent of slightly more scientific thinking, people soon realised the real reason for the returning leaves. But as everyone really liked dressing the bare trees, as the bright colours cheered them up during the dull winter months, they carried on regardless. Eventually, trees started to be brought into the house as Christmas developed into a fully fledged festival, and the practice became particularly popular in Germany. Our modern tinsel is a direct descendant of these ancient draperies, and it is as much appreciated today at Christmas time as it ever was. When putting up a Christmas tree, everyone knows that the first task is to get the lights going. These lanterns might have a Victorian feel to them, but fortunately, thanks to the miracle of electricity, they only need to be plugged in and switched on. When Prince Albert brought his Christmas tree into the royal palace, he certainly didn't have it quite so easy. Way back in the 16th century, another German, the devout reforming priest Martin Luther, was credited with being the first person to adorn a pine tree with lights. While meditating one night out in the forest, he looked up and saw the stars twinkling above the treetops. Inspired by God's majestic handiwork, he decided to recreate the moving moment for his congregation by attaching candles to the Christmas tree branches. Although this custom had such ancient beginnings, it didn't truly catch on until after Prince Albert produced his lighted Christmas tree for Queen Victoria. As ardent royal watchers copied this latest seasonal fashion, highly flammable trees, laden with, on occasion, up to 100 candles, became considerable fire hazards. It often fell to the youngest member of the family, or the most junior of the household servants, to sit next to the tree with a bucket of water whilst the candles were burning. Our modern dancing tree lights are lovely indeed, and absolutely synonymous with this very special time of the year. But there's something quite remarkable about the atmosphere created by the flickering Christmas tree candles. Switching off at the mains might be much safer, but what could compare with blowing the candles out, however many Christmases you might happen to have seen? The German traditions don't stop here. With lights and tinsel at the ready, the next thing any self-respecting tree decorator needs is a box of glittering baubles. This time we step back to old Bohemia, where the ancient craft of the glass blower was, and still is for that matter, world famous. After a frantically busy day at the workshop, refreshed only by liberal helpings of the local beer, a group of glassblowers decided to have a competition to see who could blow the biggest bubble. The winner was duly awarded even more beer, while the pretty twinkling spheres of glass were set aside. A few days later, one of the men's wives spotted them and decided that they'd make beautiful decorations, and she took the coloured baubles to the Christmas market. They were an instant success, quickly labelled spirit balls and advertised as superb at warding off the evil eye. Hung in the entrance to a house, the highly reflective surface would scare off even the most terrible of spirits, terrifying them with their own reflection. An inadvertent advertising campaign that a modern PR guru would be proud of meant that the glassblowers of Bohemia were kept busy each Christmas producing spirit balls. They were obviously an enterprising bunch, because when Christmas trees started to become popular, they miniaturized the process. The original balls were far too large to dangle on a branch, but the smaller versions that could reflect the glow of flickering Christmas lights soon covered every Christmas tree in the land, with a huge export market developing as well. Victorian Christmas tree baubles would most definitely be collector's items today, but our modern versions are pleasingly eye-catching. They are rarely made of glass, but that doesn't prevent us from enjoying the same glittering, twisting splendour that Queen Victoria and her children would have experienced all those years ago. Christmas trees were not, of course, the only form of foliage brought into the house for seasonal decoration. Long before Queen Victoria's time, the ancient custom of collecting holly, ivy and mistletoe was well established, but the Victorians did manage to come up with a few modifications of their own. This is mistletoe growing in the wild, an all-time Christmas favourite. Kissing under the mistletoe has surprisingly Christian origins, despite the rather naughtier implications of the Christmas kiss today. From the 14th century onwards, a model of the nativity scene was hung in the entrance of a house, surrounded by a hoop of green foliage, invariably including a healthy smattering of mistletoe. To greet your guests with a chaste kiss beneath this effigy was a sign of sacred Christmas love at this very special time of the year. As time passed, the nativity scene disappeared, and only the mistletoe remained, because people rather enjoyed their Christmas kissing. Without the restraint of the tradition's religious overtones, a perfectly respectable kiss on the cheek quickly gave way to far more amorous embraces. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that the morally upstanding Victorians felt it necessary to curb such wild indulgences. The white, waxy mistletoe berries became critical to the proceedings, as every time a kiss was planted beneath the strategically placed bunch, a berry needed to be removed. Once all the berries had gone, then, regrettably, the kissing had to cease. Although this did have something of a calming influence, folk became very careful about their selection of a mistletoe bough, and the bigger the bunch, the merrier the Christmas was likely to be. Holly also had a very special place in Victorian Christmas decorations. The shiny green leaves and bright red berries added a splash of colour to every household. For the townsfolk, the holly would arrive on a cart from the countryside, and everyone knew that Christmas was on its way. Some years the holly would be short on berries, but the Victorians had an ingenious answer to this. Children would be set to work with a box of dried peas and a pot of red paint, amusing themselves for hours, adding a splash of seasonal cheer to the holly. Another favourite Christmas decorating pastime developed during the Victorian era, especially for the children. The making of paper chains is a task that to this day falls to the younger members of the family, and a whole host of paper decorations started to become fashionable, along with Queen Victoria's beloved Christmas trees. Holly did not only appear inside the house, it had a significant role to play externally as well. Many a Victorian front door would be adorned with a holly wreath, but this traditional symbol of seasonal hospitality is actually of much earlier origin. It was the Romans who first started exchanging gifts of holly formed into wreaths to wish each other good health and happiness for the year ahead, when they celebrated their own midwinter festival. Today, the purchase of a holly wreath tends to be down to the householder, but it's said that for the holly to really work its magic, it needs to be presented as a gift. This lovely traditional wreath adorns the house where three very important Victorian ladies lived. Charlotte, Emily and Anne Bronte wrote their famous novels within the walls of Haworth Parsonage, and now a museum, it's presented exactly as it would have been in their day. Descriptions of Victorian Christmases in Yorkshire can be found in Charlotte's Jane Eyre and Emily's Wuthering Heights, and it's a season that's still celebrated here in traditional style. This classically cobbled high street is beautifully lit, and Christmas trees deck the lovely church of St Michael and All Angels, where the Reverend Patrick Bronte, the girl's father, had once presided. Visitors from all over the world regularly flock to Haworth's famous parsonage, and even in the cold winter chill, you'll find people enjoying the Christmas atmosphere, walking the narrow pathways of the little town, following in the footsteps of the much-loved literary Bronte sisters. When it came to writing Christmas letters, no doubt the Brontes were excellent correspondents, but not everyone was quite so enamoured with this time-consuming seasonal obligation. The sending and receiving of Christmas cards belongs very definitely to the Victorian era, because a very eminent gentleman of the period devised a cunning plan to avoid the chore of writing Christmas letters. Shortly after Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert, Henry Cole, a children's book publisher, commissioned a card to be designed with seasonal good wishes printed upon it and sent copies to all his friends and family. He was a little disappointed because he thought his idea would quickly catch on commercially, but it took another great Victorian invention to set the Christmas card industry successfully on its way. The penny post cut the cost of using the postal system dramatically, and people who could not have afforded to use it for their Christmas messages were suddenly in a position to do so. Matters improved still further when, in 1870, a half-rate postal charge for cards came into being, and a new style of Christmas greeting followed. Here you see a selection of the type of seasonal postcards that developed to take advantage of the new postal rates, and each year a veritable deluge of them fell through letter boxes everywhere. Today, we send in excess of 1,000 million Christmas cards by post annually, and many of them are still decorated with very similar images to those found on these early examples. However, the Victorians certainly had one or two very strange notions of Christmas greetings, and thankfully some of the more bizarre images have not survived to appear on our modern cards alongside festive Christmas trees and jolly old Santa Claus. Yet one Victorian image constantly adorns our best-loved Christmas cards, and it's none other than the beautiful red-breasted robin. There are many stories told of this little bird being present in the Bethlehem stable where Jesus was born. As the fire warming the stable started to go out, the robins hovered above the flames and flapped their wings to keep the blaze alive. Legend has it that by this brave action, the robin's chest was scalded red forevermore, even in the depths of the coldest winter. A Victorian connection exists, however, that gives a very different reason for the robin appearing on so many of our Christmas cards. When the new rates for postal services enticed folk to send each other ever-increasing quantities of Christmas greetings, the sight of the postman walking up your garden path was very pleasant indeed. The postal uniform of the day included a bright red waistcoat, and very quickly these welcome bringers of festive tidings earned the nickname Robins. Clever Victorian Christmas card designers painted robins carrying letters and even mail sacks, and people most definitely appreciated the joke, as the traditional use of the robin on Christmas cards became well and truly established. So, as our Christmas fire is blazing with a mantel shelf decked with Christmas cards, the clock is about to strike midnight as we move on to take a closer look at a rather more sinister seasonal tradition that has its roots very firmly planted in Victorian Britain. The telling of ghost stories on Christmas Eve had long been a popular tradition. Tales of graveyards at the dead of night where restless spirits walked would normally terrify susceptible listeners into a sleepless night, where every creaking sound meant impending doom. But folklore decreed that as the clock struck midnight as Christmas Day began, no ghost or evil presence was allowed to roam the earth until this most sacred of days was over. People could give full rein to their imaginative storytelling, without any fear of things going bump on this particular night of the year. Ancient as most of the ghost stories might have been, dabbling in witchcraft and black magic as well, it took a great Victorian author to really bring the Christmas ghost stories to prominence. Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol in 1843, and it was a huge success. His miserly hero, Ebenezer Scrooge, is visited on Christmas Eve by three ghostly spirits who teach him a lesson never to be forgotten. But why not listen to an extract from the great man's story, read in true Victorian Christmas style? Ebenezer Scrooge was a mean old miser who thought that Christmas was nothing but humbug. "If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart, he should." This is not a good start to the Christmas festivities, particularly for Scrooge's poor clerk, Bob Cratchit, who has a wife and family he would like to be with on Christmas Day. He also has a crippled son, Tiny Tim, who is very ill and might not live to see another Christmas. When Scrooge is alone in his bed, he's visited by the ghost of his dead business partner, Jacob Marley, who is wrapped in chains, weighed down with his burdens. The chain he drew was clasped around his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. Marley had come to warn Scrooge that if he didn't change his ways, he would end up in the same predicament. Three spirits then visit Scrooge, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, who show him what he must do to save himself and others around him. The first spirit appeared like a child, dressed in white, carrying fresh green holly. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish stature. "No, your past." The ghost takes Scrooge back to when he was a boy and reminds him of how he lost out on love. "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost, "that they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me," Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it." The second ghost is the spirit of Christmas present, who takes Scrooge to see Christmas at Bob Cratchit's house, where Tiny Tim is failing fast. He sat very close to his father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say he'll be spared." A definite change of heart for Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, and by the time the ghost of Christmas yet to come arrived to take Scrooge to see his own grave, the old miser is resolved to change his ways. He immediately sets out to make amends to all, and especially to his faithful servant Bob Cratchit, hoping against hope that he will be in time to save Tiny Tim. "A Merry Christmas, Bob!" said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed,
God bless us, everyone.
Each year, the reading public awaited Mr. Dickens's Christmas ghost story with bated breath, and he never failed to please, even encouraging other authors to follow suit. A man of vision indeed, Charles Dickens did equally as much as Queen Victoria to influence the thinking of his contemporaries, and he certainly had an impact on the royal lady's view of the nation that she ruled. Far more important than his Christmas ghost stories were his magnificent novels, such as the socially challenging Nicholas Nickleby and David Copperfield. Here you see a first edition Nicholas Nickleby from 1839, which dramatically drew attention to the plight of the poverty-stricken working classes. His concerns for destitute children, a circumstance that he'd experienced personally during his childhood, were clearly voiced, and he was without doubt responsible for awakening a Victorian social conscience. Yet Dickens evidently died without fulfilling everything he'd intended, because they do say that his own shadowy ghost actually walks the streets of Rochester, the beloved town of his youth, to this very day, most notably at Christmas time. Perhaps there are more stories to be told. He never finished his mysterious last novel. Or maybe he just likes to come back and see how his thoughts regarding the festive season still influence our Christmases of today. Few people realise that we've Charles Dickens to thank for our preoccupation with white Christmases. The first 8 years of young Charles's life saw snow fall every Christmas, So when he started to write and his novels required seasonal imagery, he called upon his own memories of childhood to colour the scene. Consequently, it's now impossible to think of a Christmas without snow, fuelled by the wonderful nostalgia created within the works of Dickens. For a Christmas to be deemed white in England, the Meteorological Office must record snow falling in London. And since the days of Charles Dickens, such instances have been surprisingly rare. In the whole of the 20th century, only 2 Christmas days officially had snow, 1938 and 1970, with disappointingly poor odds of it being repeated any more frequently in the future. But at least we can always turn to the evocative seasonal writings of Charles Dickens to help the imagination. And of course, his great literary legacy adds considerably more than a dusting of white powdery snow to our modern-day perception of Christmas. After all, when it came to Christmas gatherings, seasonal feasting, balls, dances and party games, as a writer, Charles Dickens was the undisputed master. At the centre of any Christmas table, the golden, steaming roasted bird was as important in Dickens's time as it is today. He often wrote about the Christmas goose, but because of the preferences of Queen Victoria, the turkey would already have been a more likely choice. Up until her defection, the royal Christmas dinner had always consisted of roasted swan, and as we've already heard, the Queen was very good at setting new trends. Soon turkey was the only fashionable Christmas poultry to serve for rich and poor alike, and this is a much-loved tradition that continues gracing our Christmas tables to this very day. With turkey as a main course, what could be more customary to serve as a dessert than the Christmas pudding? However, this seasonal delicacy has a very ancient pedigree, much older than you might suppose when reading Charles Dickens's beautifully written words extolling the virtues of Christmas pudding. It's hard to believe that this rich, dark, heavily fruited culinary concoction actually started life as a lumpy old bowl of porridge. As unappetizing as this may sound, or look for that matter, to the ancient Celts it was literally the ambrosia of the gods, because it was kept bubbling over the fire and frequently stirred as a form of worship. With the passage of time, fruits and meat were added to the pot, and very gradually the Christmas pudding that we know and love today started to emerge. The fruit was quite sufficient to add plenty of flavour, and the meat was eventually omitted, although suet is still a mainstay of most Christmas puddings. Vegetarian alternatives can be used. It'll certainly taste just as good, but you won't ever get the glossy shine that you see here. However, the sacred stirring ceremony has made its way into present-day custom. Stir-up Sunday, just weeks before Christmas, is when the puddings are traditionally made, and every member of the family gets to have a good stir, making a wish as they go. But whatever you do, don't ever stir a Christmas pudding anti-clockwise, or widdershins, as it's known in Old English, because this'll bring bad luck for the year ahead. It's customary to hide small coins in Christmas puddings, and the finder is then assured future prosperity, but it's a scaled-down version of this once far more clairvoyant tradition. Should a ring tumble out onto your plate, then you could look forward to an imminent marriage, and for a Victorian lady, this meant security and respectability. However, if a little silver thimble was all that materialised in your portion of the pudding, then no such good luck was on its way. A thimble indicated hard work and spinsterhood, something to be avoided at all cost, making coins and rings much the preferred omens. The Christmas cake is very similar to the pudding in terms of ingredients, and as often as not, those who have indulged in the lunchtime flaming pudding can't face the Christmas cake at tea time. Yet tradition never dictated the consumption of both fruity treats on the same day, and in this respect, Queen Victoria has an awful lot to answer for. By rights, the Christmas cake belonged to the old Twelfth Night celebrations that before Queen Victoria's time used to be the liveliest of occasions. It was the last day of Christmas, and before all the decorations were taken down, great parties would be held to bid a fond farewell to the festive season. A huge fruit cake was baked, ready for the arrival of all the guests, and it was cut in half with a bean hidden in each side. The men divided their half between themselves, and the women likewise, and whoever found a bean in their slice of cake was crowned king or queen of the festivities. Dancing and drinking went on well into the night, and fancy dress was often required, making the party go with a real swing. But for Queen Victoria's sense of propriety, this was all too wild and reckless. The good lady was distinctly unamused, and always ready to improve the moral fibre of her subjects, she banned Twelfth Night celebrations altogether. Today, the 6th of January, is just simply the day to put all the Christmas decorations away, and it's rather an anti-climax. Seeing out Christmas with an almighty 12th night party bang must have been a far more satisfactory way of doing things. Yet folk were reluctant to give up everything to do with 12th night, and the cake was extremely popular. Rather than lose it, a layer of golden marzipan and snowy white icing was added to the cake, and it was transferred to Christmas proper, complete with snowmen, Santa Claus, reindeer and fir trees. Queen Victoria might have put a damper on 12th night, but at least she didn't attempt to ban Christmas outright, as one of her less than royal predecessors had done. Oliver Cromwell, with his unwavering Puritan values, made regulations to outlaw the keeping of Christmas, much to the horror of most of the population of Great Britain. Rioting crowds marched in protest, but Cromwell was determined to make a stand. Fortunately, he didn't stay around for long, historically speaking, but the humble mince pie, which is so much a part of our modern-day Christmas festivities, was almost lost in Cromwell's anti-Christmas legislation. The Christmas pie was a wonderful creation, full of different kinds of minced meats and fruits, often baked in the shape of a manger to commemorate Christ's nativity. To complete this culinary masterpiece, a pastry model of the baby Jesus was added to the top, which, for the pious Oliver Cromwell, was sacrilegious in the extreme. He immediately outlawed making or consuming Christmas pie, ironically having been made to look a fool over his laws concerning Christmas pudding. Cromwell decreed that no Christmas puddings were to be made in Britain, omitting the clause about eating them. His rebellious subjects simply sent orders to France for pre-cooked puddings and carried on their festive consumption beyond the reach of the law. However, a few simple modifications to the Christmas pie circumnavigated Cromwell's dictates very neatly. Instead of being shaped like a crib, they were made round. Baby Jesus was abandoned altogether, and a change of name to Mince Pie, because of the minced meat contained within, saw the problem sorted. After Cromwell's departure and King Charles II's restoration to the British throne, Christmas returned to its former joyful self. But the mince pie never reverted back to its old style, and eventually the meat was omitted and the fruit was left to stand alone. It's been claimed that if you make a wish when you bite into your first mince pie as Christmas approaches, it'll come true. But make sure you don't refuse the first mince pie that you're offered, as this would bring bad luck for the year ahead. Tradition also suggests that a mince pie eaten on each of the 12 days of Christmas will bring great good fortune. However, this festive feasting must take place in 12 different houses, and as folk are generally offered a glass of sherry alongside their mince pies, it's not too difficult to work out why this custom became so popular, ensuring a very Merry Christmas for one and all. If you have a sweet tooth when it comes to festive food, watch out for the Christmas Yule log, a chocolate-covered concoction that has a distinctly French connection. Right across ancient Europe, the burning of the Yule log throughout the 12 days of Christmas was one of the most important customs of the season, bringing good fortune to the household for the coming year. But with the advent of the industrial 19th century, much of the once rural population moved to the rapidly growing towns and cities. Finding a huge Yule log to burn was, needless to say, rather tricky, not to mention the dangers of such a fire in the confined spaces of urban housing. The French confectioners soon came up with the perfect solution, creating the gooey delight that you see before you, and like all good Christmas ideas, it quickly spread worldwide. Today, a Yule log is very simple to create, with Swiss roll and chocolate icing. But the effect is every bit as seasonal as those ancient fires that once burnt in the hearth of every home. Christmas is the one time of the year that we still indulge in food and feasting on the grand scale of the Victorians. Healthy eating is forgotten, for Christmas Day at the very least. But as we groan with overindulgence and indigestion, we are at least able to doze lazily on a comfy sofa in front of the television. Yet there was no such lull in the proceedings for the Victorians, because as soon as the great Christmas meal had been cleared away, it was time for the fun and games to begin.
Ding dong,
A lot of the games that the Victorians would have played have stayed in use down through the years. Blind Man's Buff is always popular, more so perhaps these days at birthday parties, with Spin the Bottle and Postman's Knock proving to be great favourites with those of a more amorous disposition any time of the year. A good game of charades was also guaranteed to get the party going, with even the most respectable Victorians unbending to mime and gesticulation with theatrical flourish. Yet one of the best loved Victorian Christmas games has now disappeared almost without trace. When you discover what was actually involved, you'll understand why. Snapdragon required a large bowl filled with dried fruit and a lot of space. After an extremely liberal dosing with brandy, the fruit was set alight. In a darkened room, the blue flickering flames were nothing short of mesmerising, as each person gathered around would take it in turns to grab a handful of the burning fruit and eat it. Anecdotes of Snapdragon describe it as being almost as much fun to watch as it was to play, with people jumping around with handfuls and mouthfuls of sweet, flaming fruit. An alternative version of the game involved treating apples in exactly the same way, resulting in a considerable blaze. But even the Victorians regarded this one as being a rather dangerous pastime. It has to be said, however, having recreated Snapdragon for this programme, the fruit does taste absolutely delicious if you have the nerve to try it. Definitely not to be attempted in a confined space, and a fire extinguisher on standby is an absolute must. For most Victorian families, a piano in the front parlour was a vital piece of furniture, and at Christmas time it really came into its own. No family gathering was complete without a sing-song around the piano, and Christmas carols certainly played their part. Also, no Victorian Christmas would be worthy of the name without at least one visit from the carol singers. Many people complain that Christmas today has lost much of its religious significance, particularly when lively Christmas party songs replace the more traditional carols. But the origin of the Christmas carol is far from being on the higher spiritual plane that you might imagine. Dating back to the 13th century, English Christmas carols were sung as part of a circular dance, and the proceedings were very lively indeed. Theatricals soon accompanied the dancing and singing in churches, great and small, throughout the land, and it didn't take long for the clerical hierarchy to intervene. Christmas carols were banned from churches altogether, and this is how the tradition of carol singers travelling from house to house began. Banished from churches, the carol singers had to go somewhere, because they certainly didn't want the custom to die. With the passage of time, things have now come full circle, and carols are once again sung most reverently in churches as an integral part of traditional worship. Minus, of course, the dancing and play acting that once gave the Christmas carol such a bad name. With huge quantities of food consumed, games played sociably with friends and relations, and a rousing Christmas sing-song around the family piano, a Victorian Christmas could be considered a success indeed. Yet there were always new ideas being developed to make the seasonal festivities go off, quite literally, with an even bigger bang. Here you see a traditional Christmas cracker, a great favourite at any celebration, invented by a Victorian confectioner in the early 1840s. Tom Smith, a name that is still synonymous with Christmas crackers today, drew on different cultural experiences to come up with his great idea. On a visit to Paris, he encountered the bonbon, a sugared sweet wrapped in a brightly coloured twist of paper. At this time, English sweets never had wrappings and were sold loose from jars in the confectioner's shop. So, when Tom Smith returned home, he set about his cracker making, enclosing a sweet in paper with twisted ends. He'd also been influenced by Chinese fortune cookies with their simple messages on slips of paper, and he included a motto in every cracker. Tom Smith's Christmas crackers were a great success, but he still felt that there was something lacking. On a winter's evening, as he sat by his fireside, a cracking, spitting log inspired him further. What if he could make his crackers bang like the log when they were pulled? The extra surprise element was just what his invention needed, and they've remained popular to this day, with no sign of people ever tiring of them. Sweets have been phased out and replaced with small gifts, and the mottos are more likely to be very corny jokes or interesting facts. Another addition to the cracker has been brightly coloured paper hats shaped like crowns. These are a throwback to the old Twelfth Night celebrations and the great fruitcake discussed a little earlier. When the king and queen had been chosen, they'd put on a crown made of paper, making them feel very special for the evening. And that's basically still the idea behind these paper hats today. Even the sternest elderly relation will seem far more mellowed, crowned with a cracker paper hat, joining in the fun around the Christmas dinner table. If you ask any child today what their favourite part of Christmas is, you can be pretty sure that they'll reply, "The presents!" And for Victorian children, the gifts of the season would have been equally important. However, the giving of presents at Christmas time dates back long before the Victorian era, even predating the birth of Christ. For the ancient Britons, winter was a hard time, and survival was dependent upon storing enough food away during the summer months to see them through to the following spring. Celebrating a midwinter festival with a feast was considered essential to encourage plentiful supplies for the year ahead, and the exchange of edible gifts was very much a part of this ritual. To this day, gifts of food and drink are still very traditional and just as gratefully received as ever. The nativity scene that's on display here commemorates perhaps the best ever known presentation of gifts. The three wise men travelled from a far-off land to bring gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh to the Bethlehem stable where Jesus was born. Even the humble shepherds brought presents of baby lambs to the Christ child in celebration of his birth. Nativity scenes were certainly popular in English churches in the Middle Ages, but it was a tradition that would have been lost had it not been for a Victorian revival. With the Queen's German connections, beautifully crafted cribs were imported from Germany, where nativity scenes had always taken pride of place amongst the Christmas decorations. It was a trend that Queen Victoria would have heartily approved of, as not only honouring her beloved husband's homeland, but it also reminded her loyal subjects of a rather more spiritual Christmas message. The giving of gifts is very closely associated with Christmas morning, but the day after, known traditionally as Boxing Day, is named for a very specific type of Christmas present. Centuries back, before it had been discovered that the world was round, sailing across the sea was a terrifying business indeed. Conditions could be hazardous, and matters were made much worse because the sailors believed that the world was flat, and if they reached the edge, they'd fall off into oblivion. Before embarkation, a priest would have blessed a special box that was placed aboard the ship to help in times of trouble when the end of the world seemed moments away. When the men feared for their lives, they'd put a coin or trinket in the box and offer up a prayer for their salvation. Should the prayers be answered and the ship return home safely, the box was returned to the priest, who would keep it in the church until Christmas Day. All the boxes that had been collected through the year were opened, and the following day the money would be distributed to the poor. The tradition continued, with alms boxes being put out in churches on Christmas Day for the worshippers to make a charitable donation. Again, the day after Christmas, the money was shared out amongst the needy, and Boxing Day soon received its name. Although this was truly a Christian act insofar as those who were rich were giving to the poor, Oliver Cromwell's banning of Christmas virtually wiped out this tradition when his puritanical government prevented churches from opening on Christmas Day. If there was no congregation, there was no collection, and consequently, no money for the poor. However, the worthy poor decided to take matters into their own hands. Young apprentices who were particularly badly paid made their own collecting boxes, and in the run-up to Christmas they'd ask their employers and customers to give a donation. Boxing Day continued to be the customary occasion for the boxes to be smashed open and the money shared out. To this day, it's still traditional for paper boys and girls to receive a Christmas box from their customers, which is why even the surliest of youths will deliver the newspapers with a smile and a friendly wave in the weeks before Christmas, in the hope of a generous festive bonus. Yet no matter how customary and tangible all of this gift-giving might be, there's one very important character who's so far been noticeable by his absence. Father Christmas, Santa Claus, or Saint Nicholas, whatever you choose to call him, was by Victorian times already quite well established as a Christmas gift-giving legend, and it's fascinating to track the kindly old chap's development. The very first Father Christmas to appear in Britain came courtesy of the Vikings, way back in ancient times. One man was selected from each settlement, and he was dressed up in furs and a seasonal crown of evergreens. He would then visit all of his neighbours, who would make him as welcome as possible, because it was believed that by bestowing gifts upon this representation of winter, the onset of spring would be accelerated. Needless to say, plied with food and drink everywhere he stopped, old Father Christmas was a jolly fellow indeed, far more preoccupied with receiving than he was with giving. But far across the world, a very different Christmas character was developing in the form of Saint Nicholas, the very kind and gentle Bishop of Myra. St. Nicholas was born in the little town of Patara, not far from Myra, in Turkey in 280 AD. Nicholas was a wealthy young man, through very sad circumstances, as both his parents had died, leaving him all of their money. They'd been good Christian folk who taught their son to share whatever he had with those less fortunate than himself, and as a tribute to his parents' memory, Nicholas decided to use his wealth for the good of his fellow man. The most famous story about St. Nicholas tells of the plight of three sisters who lived nearby. Their father was old and ill, and being poverty-stricken, he was unable to offer a dowry to enable the girls to marry, with the prospect of disastrous consequences. Not only did they face destitution, but also it was likely that they'd be forced into a life of prostitution. At the dead of night, Nicholas made his way to their home in secret, carrying a bag of gold. The house was in a terrible state of disrepair, with broken windows, and Nicholas was able to throw in the gold without being noticed. Next morning, there was great rejoicing, and the eldest daughter was able to marry, but no one had any idea who their generous benefactor had been. Some days later, Nicholas repeated his good deed, and the second daughter was saved from what was then considered to be a fate worse than death. However, unbeknown to Nicholas, there'd been sufficient money to repair the broken windows, and when he returned with a bag of gold to save the youngest daughter, he was unable to throw his gift into the house as he'd done before. Nicholas spotted the chimney and cast the bag of gold high into the night sky, and miraculously it actually fell down the chimney. That evening, the girls had washed their stockings and had hung them up by the fireplace to dry. Can you imagine the delight of the youngest daughter when she found a bag of gold in her stocking? The family's fortunes had been turned around completely by the good deeds of St. Nicholas, and one of our best-loved Christmas traditions had begun. To this day, we still hang out stockings on Christmas Eve in the hope that by the morning they'll have been filled with presents and, on occasion, a bag of gold coins, although only of the chocolate variety, might have been included amongst the brightly wrapped gifts. As the years passed, word of the charitable work of Nicholas got out, despite his efforts to modestly remain anonymous. He was appointed Bishop of Myra and continued to help those in need, most notably the young and the vulnerable, for the rest of his life. Nicholas died in 345 AD and was buried where he'd served as a bishop in Myra. Within a matter of years, Nicholas had been made a saint, and the entire world heard about his kindness to the poor and needy. As a result, when his homeland was threatened by a terrible war, the body of St. Nicholas was removed from Myra and transported to a special tomb at Bari in Italy for safekeeping, where you can still visit his final resting place today. In England, there are at least 400 churches named after St. Nicholas, the majority dating back to Norman times, and it's possible that you might actually have visited one. Here you see the very famous church of St. Nicholas at Steventon in Hampshire, where the famous authoress Jane Austen worshipped as a child and young woman, and there are plenty of special churches of St. Nicholas to discover. This ruined chapel, dedicated to the popular saint, can be found in the southeast of Ireland, and rumour has it that the body of Nicholas was actually brought here rather than taken to Italy all those years ago. Now, the thought of good St. Nicholas being buried in an Irish field might seem just a little far-fetched. But when you take a closer look at the grave in question, it's not as crazy as it sounds. This is undoubtedly the burial site of a very significant clerical personage from the time of the Crusades, and although there's no proof that the mortal remains of St. Nicholas lie beneath this beautiful rolling Irish countryside, there's no proof to the contrary either. The feast day of St. Nicholas falls before Christmas, on the 6th of December each year. And to see this day celebrated in traditional style, you need to travel to Holland, where this festival is always eagerly awaited. Late in November, St. Nicholas and his faithful companion Black Peter arrive by boat in Amsterdam. Sinterklaas, as the Dutch call the saint, rides a white horse and prepares for a journey across the land on the eve of St. Nicholas's Day. Children put out their shoes filled with carrots for Sinterklaas's white horse, which by morning should have been replaced with sweets and gifts. However, they do need to have behaved themselves all year long to receive such goodies, because if they haven't, Black Peter will only leave them birch twigs as a threatening reminder to mend their ways by the next year. At this point, it's quite hard to see how the godly Sinterklaas could possibly have become amalgamated with the old pagan Father Christmas of Viking origin. But by the 17th century, travel was beginning to make the world a significantly smaller place. Through the 1600s, many Dutch people emigrated to America, and naturally they took their traditional tales of Sinterklaas with them. He soon became accepted as a fundamental part of cosmopolitan American culture, with just a few minor modifications. To simplify matters, the visit of Sinterklaas was moved to Christmas Eve, and as his name was only pronounceable by those of Dutch ancestry, it didn't take long for him to be renamed Santa Claus, which was much easier for everyone to say. Rather than abandoning St. Nicholas Day altogether, the 6th of December was designated for writing letters to Santa Claus, so that children could let him know what they really wanted for Christmas. Gradually, the slim, elegant St. Nicholas in stately bishop's robes became stouter, rounder, and altogether more a figure of fun. The chastisement of bad children was completely forgotten, and Black Peter found that he'd been made redundant. By the time Victoria came to the British throne, travel across the Atlantic was a viable option. Steamships such as Isambard Kingdom Brunel's SS Great Britain opened up the cultural exchange between the two nations, and the jolly American Santa Claus carrying a sack of gifts for children everywhere proved to be a very popular export. Throughout the Victorian era, Father Christmas, St. Nicholas and Santa Claus all became rolled into one, although he still wasn't quite the lovable gift bringer that we're used to today. Take a look at this extraordinary selection of early Christmas cards depicting Santa Claus, and you might even find it difficult to recognise him. Dressed in all sorts of strange clothing, blue, brown, green and white Father Christmases all appear, and one or two of them are very sinister looking indeed. The jolly, round-bellied, red-coated, white-bearded Santa Claus, familiar worldwide today, actually owes much of his public persona to an advertising campaign of the 1930s. Coca-Cola launched a campaign for Christmas 1931 that featured Santa Claus dressed from head to toe in their signature red and white colours. The heartwarming old fellow struck a chord with families everywhere, and he became the accepted face of Santa Claus from this time onwards. Other drinks companies, as you see from this Guinness poster, soon discovered the value of Christmas advertising, and to this day Santa Claus is used to endorse an incredible range of products at this most seasonal time of the year. When Queen Victoria was a tiny 3-year-old girl, an American professor of Greek literature wrote a light-hearted Christmas poem for his children that added an extra dimension to the legend of Santa Claus. When Clement Moore wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas, often better known as The Night Before Christmas, he created a homeland for Santa Claus amongst the snowy wastes of Lapland and a mode of transportation that would inspire the imaginations of generations to come. Here you see reindeer in their natural habitat, and for Moore there was no better way for Santa Claus to travel than by sleigh and a team of 8 flying magical reindeer. Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donder and Blitzen were responsible for getting Santa Claus all around the world on Christmas Eve, and every child, from the publication of this poem onwards, has listened for the sound of sleigh bells as they fall asleep on the most special night of the year. For the Victorians, it would have been impossible to think of travelling to the Arctic Circle to visit Santa Claus in his own home. But for a growing number of fortunate youngsters today, it's an extra special Christmas treat. This illustrates perfectly how a concept popularised during the Victorian era can have been built upon and improved beyond all recognition. As our Victorian Christmas draws to a close, it would be impossible to let this programme finish without taking a look at New Year celebrations. And of course, this means travelling north of the border to Scotland. If you visit Edinburgh, you'll find the house of John Knox, the great reforming priest who worked tirelessly to bring a sense of religious sobriety to this nation. Under his guidance, Christmas Day was set aside purely for devotional purposes, and the lively celebrations, so beloved of the Scots, were transferred to New Year, or Hogmanay as it's better known. To this day, the feasting, dancing, drinking and singing is as noisy as ever, and on the stroke of midnight people pour out onto the streets to make as much noise as possible, a custom that was traditionally to scare off the evil spirits lurking at the turn of the year. Here you see Princes Street, in the long shadow of Edinburgh Castle, where thousands of revellers from all over the world gather to see out the old year and ring in the new, in true Scottish style. The national drink is undoubtedly whisky. That New Year it is consumed in vast quantities. This is the Glenfiddich distillery at the heart of Speyside, and it makes a perfect tipple for the season. At Hogmanay, Scottish householders need to ensure that they've sufficient supplies of whisky to quench the thirst of the first footers who come to call. This custom is rather sexist, as good fortune will only come to your house if a dark-haired young man is the first to cross your threshold after the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve. A female first footer will only bring bad luck, but perhaps this was just a convenient excuse for the men to keep all the whisky for themselves. If fortune smiles and you get a male first footer, he'll bring gifts of coal and bread to wish you a warm house and plenty to eat for the coming year. In return, he'll receive generous measures of whiskey for his trouble, because to refuse a first footer a wee dram would spell disaster for the entire household. Queen Victoria played a significant role in the export of Scottish New Year customs south of Hadrian's Wall, which is rather ironic when you consider the lengths she went to in order to abolish the great Twelfth Night parties. Yet for Queen Victoria, Scotland was a place of great escape from the onerous duties of royal life, and we do know that she wasn't adverse to a tot of whiskey from time to time herself. The countryside was also of great solace to her, particularly after the death of her beloved Prince Albert, and her beautiful castle at Balmoral is still a favourite royal retreat to this very day. Throughout the course of this programme, it's become increasingly evident that Queen Victoria influenced the thinking of her subjects considerably, and this is equally true of the public perception of Scotland. Thanks to her, fearing the wild Scots was a thing of the past, and her love of all things Scottish saw many of the country's customs and traditions embraced the length and breadth of her glorious empire. There's no denying the influence of the Victorians on our modern-day Christmas and New Year celebrations. From Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's Christmas trees, right through to the evocative seasonal writings of Charles Dickens, the grateful nation was delighted by the colourful growth of the Christmas festival. At a time of great social change, when hardship was often rife as a result of the Industrial Revolution, a Victorian Christmas did at the very least offer a few days' respite and a message of hope. Queen Victoria died almost with the birth of the 20th century in January 1901. And since then, many other people of note have added their own unique touches to the way we celebrate Christmas. But no expression of the season's greetings will ever compare with wishes for a very happy Victorian Christmas. And hopefully, after enjoying this truly nostalgic programme, you'll now know exactly why.